Luminary presents Therapy versus the World. I'm your host, Joe Nucci, and today I'm very, very excited to share an episode with you with Trey Tucker. Trey is a licensed psychotherapist who treats anxiety, depression, couples communications issues, trauma, identity, dabbles in sports psychology, and so much more. He has a social media presence where he reaches over 1 million followers. In today's episode, Trey and I talk about what it's like to be men in a mostly female and woman-dominated profession, and what it's been like for our own journeys as men, not just on our own mental health, but also becoming therapists. I really, really enjoyed talking to him. The whole hour flew by in like 2 minutes, and so I think it's going to be really, really fun for you to listen to as well. And before we get started, if you wouldn't mind hitting that like button, that subscribe button, or rating Therapy versus the World, we would really, really appreciate it. Trey, welcome to the show. I'm really, really excited to talk to you and get to know you a little bit.
Me too, Joe. Appreciate it. Looking forward to getting to know you.
Well, for those listening that aren't super familiar, could you just talk a little bit about your background, specifically how you got into mental health and what it's been like? You've been working in the field for over a decade. Is that right?
It is. And I did not start out as a therapist. I actually started out in the corporate world. I'll back up a little bit before that. When I was in high school, my high school counselor had a big impact on me and a lot of other people too. And I just found the power of a simple listening ear. You know, he wasn't really doing what we would call high level therapy at that point. He just was looking out for students who needed a hand in the dark and just to figure out, how do I make it through life, especially life as a teenager. And he was just such a reassuring presence, a warm, welcoming presence, non-judgmental, just very accepting, and almost like an angel on earth. And so many people just wanted to be around him. And you just kind of felt like everything was going to be okay when you were around him. And I don't think it really registered for me at that point that he was making that kind of an impact. But I think maybe on a heart level, I realized, all right, this is the kind of life change that I want to be a part of. And it was kind of a seed that started to grow in me. And I always kind of looked back and I realized, all right, people liked to open up to me when I wasn't really trying to get them to open up. I always like to listen more than talk. And so hearing people's stories was always fun for me, and trying to figure out why certain people did certain things or said certain things. That was always a fun challenge for me. And, but I didn't put two and two together about, hey, this might be pointing to a career as a counselor. But in the corporate world, I realized, you know, I'm making good money and I have what the world would call a successful life, quote unquote. And I was in the marketing world, so it was a fast-paced kind of thing. It was fun. There were elements of psychology for sure, but every day I would just leave work thinking, is this all there is to a job? It's just like checking the box, working the 9 to 5 kind of thing. And I knew that wasn't what I was wired for in particular. We need people that are wired for that. I'm not slamming that whatsoever, but just for me, it was something that, it was a clue that while it was a learning stage in the corporate world for me, it definitely wasn't the final destination. And so mid-career, I go into the counseling world, or do grad school part-time, which took forever, as I'm sure you can relate, and finally, get out on the other end of grad school and do all the internship phases and all the tests. And so, yeah, a decade later, here I am. And I'm thankful for that journey, and we can go into whatever level of detail you want, but I'm thankful for that journey before becoming a therapist, because I'm able to bring maybe some experiences that, I don't know, some people that came fresh out of college as a therapist might not be able to bring, maybe some perspectives to add some stories that might help empathize with someone else's experience. And I don't know, just a kind of a richer plate to choose from as I'm working with somebody. So yeah, that's the overview of how it all happened.
All right. And what was precisely missing for you? A sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, feeling like you were making a contribution when you were in that corporate world. In hindsight, what do you have now that you didn't have then?
Yeah, contribution is the word. You hit the nail on the head. I was contributing to a corporation's bottom line, which, it's a good thing. It was providing jobs for me and other people. But that was the extent of the contribution. I've just always, I've always been fascinated with how do I impact somebody maybe for the rest of their life if possible, or at least make their day a little bit better. But it's always been about that face to face impact. And those moments were just few and far between in the corporate world. It was very much just production oriented and get the job done for the day and then you move on. Now, the pro of that is you can leave your job behind and you don't have to be stressed about it so much after work. But it was just empty because, like you said, that lack of contribution.
I'd love to. There's so many things that I'd love to dive in with you, but one of my personal curiosities in terms of talking with you is about what it's like being a man in a profession that, at least today, is mostly run by women. Even 50 years ago, it was not the case. The ratio was inverted, but that's not how it is anymore. I know for me personally, whenever I was in a group didactic in my internship, or even when I was in classes in school, I was often the only man. And sometimes when there were other men, they were other members of the LGBT community. And so, not that people in that community aren't men as well. Of course they can be, but there was still a very distinct feminine presence, I would say, kind of a feminine energy, and that makes perfect sense because it's a caretaking profession, and stereotypically that's the kind of personality it attracts. And so I'm just kind of curious. I was struck by how the person that made a impact on you when you were younger was a male therapist. And now you being a man, anyways, there's not even a really specific ask. I would just love to get your general reflections on what that's been like for you.
Oh, it is so fun because I'm sure with some of your experiences with male clients, they come in kicking and screaming and dragging their feet. I'm not doing this. It's just somebody else forced them into the office. And it is a blast for me to be able to shift their perspective, or at least give them a little bit of a preview of like, hey, this doesn't have to go like you think it's going to go. And just even one or two meetings in, it's amazing how I'll get to see some of these guys open up in ways they never thought they would be able to open up or be willing to do, just simply because they had one preconceived notion coming in. And just by nature of the fact of, I don't know, my personality, my background, whatever, I'm kind of kicking the door in on that preconceived notion. And that's such a fun thing for me, because then if that preconceived notion can get broken on the surface, then think of how many other beliefs and habits might get unbroken and unbound in their journey along the way too. So yeah, it is definitely I don't know, I kind of think of it as a superpower, just because folks like you and me, we are definitely in the minority of this world, at least. And um, I don't know how many guys would open up to let's say a female therapist just on the front end. If they had never met with a therapist before, how many of them would even show up in the first place? And then those who showed up, how much would they really open up and dive in? I don't know. I know in my journey before becoming a therapist, I met with a couple of female therapists, and there was always just some insecurities in me about like, well, I shouldn't bring up this topic, or maybe this one needs to stay over under the rug for a while, just because there is that fear of judgment of like, what is this female going to think of me, a male, even separate from anything therapy related. So yeah, it's been a fun journey in that respect. And yeah, I think like you said, because a male therapist had such a good impact on me, I caught a vision for that potential impact even before I knew I was catching that vision.
So for you, because male or male identifying therapists are in the minority, you find it to actually be a contribution, kind of like you said earlier, and a value add, particularly when it comes to treating men, because they come in and you can maybe reflect certain things, become empathetic about certain things, or at the very least, they have this preconceived notion that the therapist they're going to see is probably a woman, probably, very emotions focused, very kind of like, overly like, compassionate. Not that you're not focused on being compassionate and emotional, but it just kind of breaks that stereotype for them. And that's kind of your entry point in.
Exactly, breaking that stereotype. And I kind of look at it as a little bit of a rescue mission, not to make it too dramatic, but honestly, if there were no therapists that certain men could identify with, then who's going to go get them? Who's going to help them out? So I figured, my niche might be a little bit smaller as far as who I'm able to connect with in a way, but I'm maybe hitting a group that the very few other people might be able to hit. So I consider it a big privilege because, I grew up loving superheroes, right? Like Batman, Superman, those were my obsessions. And so now I kind of look at it in a hopefully a healthy way of like, all right, well, this is my rescue mission, this target audience. And of course, I meet with a bunch of other people outside of that demographic, but the fun part is helping people break that stereotype initially of like how therapy should go, quote unquote.
I know a question I often get from friends, family, loved ones, people on social media, prospective clients and patients. They often ask, do I need to see a therapist like me, or is that somehow better for me? I know I have an answer I give to that. I'm wondering what yours is, and I'll share mine as well. How does identity come into the therapeutic alliance for you?
So you're saying their question is, should I see a therapist that's like similar to my own personality, like the client's personality?
Or identity, race, gender, sexuality.
Yeah, I try not to have one standard answer I give to that question because I try to get to know the person and figure out why they're asking that question. Because usually if I can figure out why, then I might be able to give them an answer that's actually fitting for them. Typically when somebody asks me that question, it's because they're trying to figure out, am I going to get rejected? There's this fear a lot of times in us guys, at least the guys that I talk to, there's like, if I show up, if they're different from me, like, am I going to feel awkward? Are they going to, is the whole thing just going to be a colossal mismatch? And am I going to feel rejected? They usually don't use that word rejection, but that's essentially what they're aiming at. So what I tell them is, look, go with somebody that you think you're going to be comfortable with. And I tell them about the research about, rapport being the most important aspect of therapeutic alliance. And so I said, look, show up to somebody you feel like you're going to be comfortable with. And then 2 or 3 sessions in, see how it's going. And if you feel like there's not really a click, then let's look for some other options. Because a lot of times people have to learn for themselves. If I say, well, okay, this therapist might not align so much with your personality or your identity, but they're trained in some things that I think can really help you. If they're not bought in on their own, I've just not seen that work really well in my own experience. So a lot of times I'll say, all right, try somebody who's similar first. And if you feel like the progress isn't there, then let's come back to this original list that maybe where the training is more specific to your need. But tell me your answer, because I definitely want to hear that.
Well, my answer is I tell them about my practicum and internship experience, and in the private practice I was working at in graduate school, and the times that they were able to give me offices, because I don't know if you see anyone in person anymore, but this was back in the day when we saw people in person only. Right. The times I mostly got moms, and I saw a lot of people on Medicaid, and so it was a lot of African American women, a lot of people of color, people from a very different socioeconomic and racial and cultural background from me. And so that was actually those were a lot of my first clinical experiences. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really mixed, because on one hand, I think that being not of the same identity, I sometimes asked maybe, quote unquote, stupid questions that they actually ended up finding very helpful, because they didn't really ever have to explain that before, or they thought it was obvious, and having to articulate it provided some therapeutic benefit. I'm thinking of some cases I've worked with, particularly around survivors of sexual assault. And I'm remembering one case where she said, I thought about switching after the first few sessions because she hadn't disclosed it and she wasn't sure. But later in hindsight, she said, but actually building trust and rapport with a man, even though that's not what I came in wanting, was actually more helpful than maybe kind of being with a woman. And so I often share some version of that anecdote, because I let them know, it's often highly unpredictable, exactly like what you think the thing you need to work on is, what it ends up being. And I think it's both and, right? On one hand, I do think good therapy is good therapy. And I do think that in our field, there are certain types of knowledge encoded in identity that's very, very hard to pass on to people in the out group. Yeah. And if what you're seeking therapy for is very identity focused, then probably you should consider working with someone of that same identity or someone who's competent. I have some wonderful heterosexual colleagues that honestly teach me a thing or two about gay culture and norms and different things. And so, it really depends, I think, at the end of the day on their experience.
Yeah, yeah, I fully agree. I love that because there is so much growth that can come from maybe building a bridge with somebody you didn't think it was possible to build a bridge from it, whether it just be the differences from the outside looking in that caused the fear, or maybe like in the case of a sexual survivor, the mentality of why should I trust any man? So yeah, the healing that can come from building that kind of bridge is immense. And then the whole idea of a shared experience that I love the narrative therapy and specifically seeing your life as a story. And so if you can find a therapist that understands your story because they've lived a similar story, that can be monumentally healing without even knowing it, just because, okay, let's say if I've made similar stupid decisions as one of my clients, they're going to immediately feel accepted and not judged because of their own stuff, because they know, all right, I've lived it too. My story is basically your story. So yeah, like you said, it's going to be a mixed bag or a case by case basis on something like that.
Yeah. I had this really, really wonderful podcast interview with Warren Farrell. If you know who that is, he researches a lot of kind of men's issues and stuff like that. And there was this really lovely moment in that episode where we were kind of talking about, kind of archetypally, the differences of parenting styles between moms and dads. And he was saying that, there's, if you study how dads cross-culturally will parent their kids, there's often, more roughhousing, more teasing. There's kind of more this like confrontational, quote unquote, masculine like energy. And I remember he joked and he said, and sometimes during the roughhousing, the mom might be looking at them being like, oh gosh, now I have another kid to think about or whatever it is. But actually that rough and tumble play, as I'm sure you might know, is really important for development. And of course, what moms bring is different, but also needed. And it got me thinking about how I actually show up in my masculine and feminine authenticity with my patients. Because obviously, parenting dynamics come up in therapy. And I brand myself in my private practice, I say, I kind of brand myself a little more of like tough love therapist. What's my tagline? It's something like therapy is for a good time, not a long time type thing. And it's because I'm very interpersonal and I'm very collaborative and I'm very intersubjective. And I tell people in the consult, like, look, I'm gonna tell you what I think, and you're allowed to tell me back if I'm missing something or whatever it might be. But once I get to know people, I will often adjust. And sometimes I do feel like I'm kind of leaning on the more kind of, person-centered, Rogerian, like very like warm, compassionate, like very, very non-directive. And then other times, I particularly, and I notice that maybe just anecdotally, like a slight skew with gender, but particularly with some of the guys that I treat, because mostly men reach out to me. They come in and I'm just like, oh, you need someone you want someone to raise their voice at you today. Like, interesting. Like, let's do it. Let's rough and tumble play. And like, of course, it's out of love. It's out of care. And I share that just to get any immediate reflections you have. But I'm also wondering specifically, how do you manage that range? What has that been like for you personally? Has that been a journey for you to kind of access all of that, if that's even how you go about it?
Let me put it this way. In high school, I played sports. And then also after the corporate world, I did some sports coaching. And I think I did that for so long. It just became my cadence and the way that I communicate certain issues. And it inadvertently ended up in the therapy room with me because that's just me. I'm a coach at the core. So it's like you said, some people, they want to be like, all right, let's go, get the ass in gear kind of thing. So I was going to ask you this because I'm trying to figure out the answer myself. I don't know that I have a real protocol for when I use that. It's more of a gut feeling thing where it just kind of feels like it needs to come out a little bit. Obviously, I have to have the relationship with them first. It's not going to be like a first session kind of thing, but it does come in handy at times because sometimes they do want to be, I don't know, treated as an athlete where the coach is telling them, look, you can do this. Let's go. This is what it takes. But how do you determine when to use it?
It's largely intuitive on my end as well. I would say that if there's some sort of protocol or system that I use, I typically, not always, but my go-to for the first handful of sessions when I'm kind of more in assessment mode is I am pretty reflective, non-directive, kind of like I said, like the more like kind of person-centered. Because I want to know that what I think I'm seeing and hearing is what they think they're telling me and showing me.
Yep.
And
Yep.
based on that, I'm really fond of this phrase. It was actually one of a therapist who I was the client of gave it to me. I thought it was so lovely. She said, you can learn someone's personality within minutes, but learning their character takes time. And I think with whether or not someone wants that, more like kind of directive approach or non-directive approach or whatever it might be, I do think I think personality plays a lot into that. And so after the first few sessions, I kind of get a sense, more often than not. And I think, and this is where the intuition comes in, if I ever start pushing on something more directly and they become dysregulated or it becomes too much, or I see their defenses and walls just kind of go up again, then we can slow down and let's actually take a minute and notice that and normalize that and make it okay. And then take it a little bit more slowly. More or less, I think that's how I might think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I'm with you. I'm very much person-centered first. And if I end up getting to the point where I'm kind of using that coaching on them, I almost always use some motivational interviewing first. I don't know if that's part of your repertoire, but I've found it to be incredibly powerful. Just because if you can ask them certain questions where they'll see the vision for their life and what it could be if they took certain steps, then I don't need to do a whole lot of motivating once they catch the vision. But inevitably, once they've caught the vision, there's going to be certain fear points along the way that try to block them. And a lot of times that's where that kind of getting in their face a little bit, saying, "No, you got this. This is definitely something that you're capable of." That's what I try to make sure that if I'm quote unquote yelling or getting somebody's face, it's in
Yeah.
an encouraging way. Obviously you and I both know that shaming never works. And so a lot of times that can re-traumatize somebody, maybe because the reason they're stuck in the first place is because someone yelled at them in shame. So I'm using the big kind of loud voice and more of the encouraging, like, nah, quit buying into these lies. You have this.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction because depending on whoever's listening, depending on their experience with sports and coaches, I played sports growing up and I had some coaches that I loved and still think about very fondly and some that maybe left some to be desired. But for anyone listening, particularly if you didn't play sports, the kind of like the directive kind of tough love from a coach isn't always like, do 10 more push-ups, like you wimp or like whatever. It is the kind of, I like what you said, like you got this, or I think kind of the meta narrative of what I'm often communicating is like, man, we're going to figure this out. I'm here with you. It's all good. I think for me, the way I bypass, inadvertently triggering shame with what could be perceived as critical feedback is I use a ton of humor in my sessions. And I tell them that on day one. I go, listen, you'll cry. I might even cry. Like stuff will come up, but laughter can be just as cathartic. And I find that that's one of the ways I motivate. I wouldn't necessarily articulate my style as one like a coach, but it's more just if they let's say if they kind of slip back into old patterns, it's just kind of like, what I'm going to say to you, man. Like, what were you thinking?
Right.
Like, what were you thinking adding one more thing when all we've talked about for the last 6 months is you take on too much,
Right.
but let's actually break it down. Like, what were you thinking?
Right. Yep, exactly.
So,
using that humor that brings down the walls. That's so good.
Yeah. Do you you were talking about motivational interviewing, about person-centered therapy. Do you rely on specific orientations? Do you identify as integrative?
Integrative for sure. And I keep trying to add more. So a couple of years ago, I got trained in EMDR, and that has been incredibly helpful for certain people. I definitely wouldn't call it the magic bullet that some people would call it, because I've definitely used it with clients that haven't had any success with it. And fully transparently, I've tried it as a client and didn't get a whole lot of success out of it myself. But there have been enough people who have that I've been able to administer that with, where I keep it as part of my repertoire. of course, CBT was the first modality that I kind of landed on, and then I realized it's good for certain issues that maybe are more simplistic and surface level. And then with more trauma focused types of issues, it's probably, to me, CBT can get into an area where it feels like you're gaslighting yourself because logically, a certain belief isn't the case. But there's something subconsciously or more down in the heart and soul where it still feels true. And so you're telling yourself the truth in the front of the brain, but yet there's another part down there that's like, nah, this ain't true at all. So it just, I don't know, it seems to create more friction sometimes in certain people. So I've started to add IFS into my repertoire, internal family systems. And that one, I don't want to get too excited about it too soon because I'm new to the whole process, but it seems to have the greatest potential of at least all the modalities that I've had some exposure to. But what about you?
Yeah. So I was trained psychodynamically in school, and I had the great fortune, I would even call it, of my supervisors in my practicum were very cognitive behaviorally oriented. And so I mostly think of myself as kind of an integration between the more kind of psychoanalytical, psychodynamic, perspectives, like with the more kind of practical, cognitive behavioral. I integrate a lot of somatic style therapies. I'm trained in clinical hypnosis, which is, speaking of EMDR, I'm not trained in EMDR, but whenever I learn a little bit more about it, there seems to be a lot of overlap there. And sometimes I think a lot of the wars over EMDR, this is just my opinion, I would love to know as someone that consumes a lot of research, is people are so busy trying to figure out how to substantiate this, like what's the validity of this construct? Like how do we define this construct? And then at the end of the day, I think a lot of therapists are kind of like, well, you let me know. I'm going to use this tool when it feels viable, and I'm going to do it in a way that doesn't cause more harm as per my ethical code. But please let us know. I don't know. That's kind of how I view it.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. You could get, and early in my career, I did this. I got so tied up in knots about, I shouldn't use it unless there's, these 4 protocols that fit. And I'm like, I'm like you said, I'm just going to make sure I'm not doing any harm. And I'm going to go with the intuition of, it seems like this tool could be a fit for this person. So let's tread lightly and try it out. And I've tried to make that more of the focus rather than following each step to the legalistic limit.
Yeah. Do you ever get the impression, because I was just like that, I put a lot of pressure on myself to be very, by the book in a lot of ways. And the older I've gotten, or the more experience I've accrued in this practice, and therapy, it's like law or medicine. It's a craft. It takes knowledge. We have to practice applying it. I kind of think the open secret is you're supposed to break some of those rules once you feel like it's almost like kind of taking off your floaties and jumping off into the deep end of the pool or something. Yes. That's been my experience because, when I particularly being psychodynamically trained, I didn't self-reveal ever, when I first started practicing. And now it's like in the consult, I'm just kind of like, like whatever. And it's just, and of course, I'm skillful, I'm intentional about it. It's still all for the person I'm trying to help. But that's just one example of, I was like, well, that rule I just totally threw out the window, and some of the more structured protocols as well. That's been my experience, at least.
Yes, I'm the same exact way. Because in grad school, they scare the life out of you to make sure that you don't break any of the rules. Obviously, with good intention, they're trying to keep us from really messing somebody up. But like you said, any modality that I've learned about basically got discovered by accident when they were trying to break rules of other things they've been trained in, and they just kind of stumbled upon this new thing that they were just trying because the old stuff wasn't working with their client. And so how are you going to get creative unless you're allowed to color outside the lines a little bit? And like you said, with the self-disclosure thing, I do that all the time as well, because going back to the male thing, we have been, I don't know if we've ever been told this stuff, but we kind of pick it up along the way that, we should act like we have it all together. We shouldn't talk about our struggles. We don't show weakness, all the stuff that however it gets put into our brain, it gets put there. And I don't know of a better way to get somebody else to take a risk with me unless I take a risk with them first. And so opening up on some of my struggles, like you said, even on the consultation, I'm like, all right, here's where I am. Here's one of the messes that is going on in my life, and one of the things, whatever it is, I feel it out, and I kind of try to see if I can say something that's self-revealing that will get them to reciprocate.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about building safety, because if they feel safe enough to show one of their perceived
Yeah.
weaknesses or struggles, we can
Yeah.
run with that. We can make good progress with that. But if they don't feel safe, then they're going to put on a mask, and basically I'm just dealing with
Yeah.
their mask rather than the real them. But somebody told me it's an anecdote one time. It may not even be a true story, but somebody said there was a pastor one time who was preaching a sermon, and he was up at the pulpit, and he was talking about anxiety, and he had his bottle of anti-anxiety medication up there with him, and he took one of his pills in front of the congregation, and he said, I'm showing you this part of me now so that you know that it's safe to show these parts of yourself to the people you trust as well. And he says, I'm giving you the gift of going second, because I'm going first in getting vulnerable. And man, I love that idea of just giving somebody else the gift of going second, because it's a scary thing to be
Mm.
the first one to divulge something or to open up in a certain way. And without vulnerability, we're stuck. I won't say that's the most important aspect of getting better, but I'd put it on the Mount Rushmore of techniques or tactics of
Yeah.
you are not going to grow and improve as a person and get to the places you want to get without vulnerability. So that, for me, that used to be a big weakness of mine. Even when I was first became a therapist, I did not want to get vulnerable with anybody, much less in the office. But over the years, I've realized I I have to do this for my own good, and I'm going to be much
Mm-hmm.
more of a help to other people, both professionally and personally. So now
Mm-hmm.
I consider vulnerability a superpower of mine, and sometimes I'll even overshare in my personal life, but I'm okay doing that because it means I'm pushing the other limits because I stayed on the other side of the equation so long.
Mm-hmm. The gift of going second. That's maybe the most beautiful defense of self-disclosure I've
Mm.
heard. And I mean, I think it obviously is relevant to any patient or client of any sex or gender or background. But I do agree with what at least I heard you implying, which is it's particularly effective for men because they don't have
Mm.
as many cultural examples of it. You know,
Yeah.
even in today's world, some of those beliefs still run really deep. I was rewatching Brene Brown's TED Talk on, I mean, I know she's had, a few very famous ones, but there in one of them, she says, she tells this story, speaking of being vulnerable. I thought this was incredibly vulnerable of her to admit, and she did it, and she does it so skillfully that when I first saw this, it didn't even occur to me the gravity of what she was saying. She says, I was signing books after a talk or a show, and this man came up to me and he said, I like what you had to say about shame. I'm interested why you didn't bring up men. And at the time, this was like a few years before she gave this speech, she said, oh, well, I don't study men. And he said, well, isn't that convenient? And it's anyone listening, like, I love Brene Brown. Like, I'm not knocking Brene Brown. I'm more
Right,
just
right.
commenting on even within the mental health field. I just, what I like about that example is it really highlights how pervasive and insidious some of these kind of ideas and beliefs into you. Because I mean, if it got Brene Brown, like the premier researcher of shame, it got you at some point in your life. You know what I mean? And so I've been bringing up that example a lot, even with patients or even just, in my media work, because I'm just kind of like, oh my gosh, like this is like I said, it's a great example to highlight this problem.
Absolutely. I did not know that story, but my goodness, yeah. If it blinded her to the fact that men need this help, then yeah, we're all going to be blinded by that. Goodness gracious.
Absolutely. You brought up some of your own experiences learning to be vulnerable, how much that's helped you as a therapist, how much that's helped you as a person. What would you like to share with anyone listening about what it's been like on your own mental health journey as a man?
The biggest thing is the physical sensations that we call emotions. They get out of me in a good way so much faster when I'm choosing to be vulnerable. Because when we bottle them up,
Mm,
we stuff them, they just stay in there and rot. It's like trying to bury something that's still alive. Like you can cover it up all you want, but that thing's still alive. It's going to push through the dirt. And
Mm,
I didn't even realize that that's what I was doing for so long, even before becoming a therapist. Because, as a, whether it's being a young man or being on an athletic field, you just taught to kind of keep the game face on and be a soldier and keep
mm,
moving. And you don't even realize that you're stuffing things. Because I I don't think anybody other than my high school counselor, and we didn't even get into it all that much. I don't think anybody in my life ever sat me down and told me, all right, here's what emotions are, here's what they're not, and here's how to deal with them. It just
mm,
kind of just was never brought up. Nobody ever was purposely trying to hide it or be neglectful about it. I think just,
mhm,
life's quick and busy and stressful and you just keep moving. And so that's the message that I took away. And then I realized at some point around college, I guess, I realized that, man, I feel like I've got some sort of anxiety. I didn't know that that was really the word back then. I just felt like I was
mm,
kind of had butterflies in my chest a lot. And so I started the therapy journey a little bit. I didn't go to many sessions, I think maybe three or four. And it was pretty surface level and just kind of talked about whatever the circumstances were that were causing the anxiety. And those resolved themselves. And so I felt good again. So I didn't do anything about it. But every time I would struggle ever since then, it always kind of felt the same way physically. The butterflies in the chest, the tingling in the hands, not being able to get a full breath. It wasn't like I was hyperventilating all the time, but I just couldn't get a full breath. I was like, I
mm,
don't like this. This is very uncomfortable. I want out of this. So I I started looking into ways of dealing with anxiety that were more than just talking, and I realized that somatic work is, for me at least, the way to deal with it. And like you said, like you like working with it too. And for people that don't know that term, somatic work is basically tuning into your body and trying to figure out what it's saying. Because so often, at least for me and the people I work with, we intellectualize. It's everything is thinking, thinking, thinking. There was a time
mm,
I was a client of a therapist, and we were having good conversations, and I was figuring out the reasons for saying certain things, the reasons I was doing certain things, and I would be like, yeah, yeah, that's good, and I would write it down. And after the fourth or fifth time of me writing down whatever the realizations were, he's like, stop writing it down. Like, just let your body feel it. It's like, speaking of people kind of getting in your face,
yeah.
being a coach for you, he was that for me. As I thought, oh my gosh, he's right. I live in my head so that I don't have to deal with whatever is going on in my body because it's so uncomfortable. But when I finally started that process of purposely feeling the physical sensations, letting them do whatever they want to do in a safe place, and then allowing stuff to come out, whether that be screaming, yelling, crying,
Mhm.
hitting, I mean, whatever needed to come out in a safe way, I let it out. And man, it has drastically improved my quality of life.
Mhm.
I still struggle, but I don't struggle as long anymore because I allow that stuff to come through and to say whatever message it's been trying to say.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you talk about all of this because I've talked to other colleagues about this specifically about their own personal work, and we've all have kind of arrived at this. I'll just tell you how I articulate it. It's something like one of the best emotional regulation tools that we depend on is the to practice what we preach, to whatever the feeling is, drink it all in, let it all come up, let it all come out, and however, whatever that looks like, and then you move on. You don't necessarily let it affect your behavior. You don't necessarily, like externalize it. You don't necessarily internalize it. It just, the way forward is through. Or if you're not following that advice, that which you resist tends to persist.
Yep.
you
Yep.
know, and it's something that actually close friends and loved ones and even ex partners have reflected to me because it's only people that are that close to me that actually see that in practice, and they say, "Oh my gosh," they can say it's you're so intense, but only for like a second, and then you're fine. And I go, "Yeah, oh my god, yeah, that was awful." I was like, "Oh, I'm like so glad that that's out of me," you know. And not that I'm a robot and do it perfectly every time, but with practice, it does get better.
How did you first get into that practice? Because it was not an easy thing for me. Was it a challenge for you on the front end?
It it was. So I'm thinking about, well, earlier I was thinking about the different types of the therapeutic relationships that I've had, and there were therapists growing up after the passing of my father, which I've talked about in other episodes, that were immensely helpful. But also, I mean, adolescent therapy it's kind of its own beast because your brain's coming on, but it's not totally developed in a lot of ways. I don't know if you work with adolescents. I personally don't, but
I do.
it's its own beast. And
Yeah.
I started seeing someone again. I saw a woman, a female therapist who was actually largely person centered, going back to earlier. And I went to her when I was in grad school, and I don't know. I mean, I have theories about what she thought, but I don't know what exactly was about me from that first session that made her think that she was like, this is the one technique that this guy needs. But she was. I remember her as very skillfully person centered, because it wasn't. I mean, the returns were just so amazing in my experience. And I know that at a certain time with her, I was very frustrated because I wasn't able to feel certain unpleasant emotions, specifically sadness. Like it really felt inaccessible to me. And the overachiever in me was like, how am I supposed to be a good therapist if I can't feel this? And I remember actually, and of course, being so person centered, she just kind of like agreed and supported everything. But I actually, ended up doing, and I actually do this with clients now if it's a fit. I ended up actually doing outside of session a mood induction. This is actually a CBT term in which you kind of look up like YouTube videos or watch movies that will activate the unpleasant emotion. And so for me, it was a lot of movies about like people losing their family members, like in the hospital. That was obviously quite, quite specific to me.
Yeah.
But then, or it could like one of the other ones that always got me was like soldiers, like veterans, like returning home and surprising their kids. And I remember at that time, I would sit there and I'd be like, I really had to force it. I was like, oh my God, like this tear, it's like, it's gonna come out. And then I would suck it right back in, like so masculine, so stoic, you know what I mean? And then I was like, oh, that was great. You know what I mean? Like, but like, was it, and then I think that was followed by some, really great, kind of corrective emotional experiences I had with Lauren at the time. I then also later with a different practitioner. That's where I discovered somatic therapy as a patient first, not as a practitioner. And it was weird because when I started practicing, I remember thinking, I was like, well, why don't, like that seemed to work really well for me. Like I need to go learn about like how to facilitate this for others. When it's appropriate, of course. And then I think over time, just being a growth oriented person, there's all sorts of things I can say. But I wanted to share the mood induction piece because I think that just like the sucking back in the tear is literally what it felt like, And so how did I get my start? Definitely very self motivated. Was the overachiever in me, was that from a purely healthy place? I don't know. I'll take it.
Yeah. Don't overanalyze it.
Totally. Yeah. One of my old supervisors, because I'm self-aware of like my kind of inner overachiever, and I forget what it was, but I remember talking to her one day, and I kind of made that joke, and she was just like, she was like, as your supervisor, like I kind of want to encourage a little bit of the overachievement. She was like, go read that book, like go, and so all that to say, so that was a big part of my experience. And something else that I've found, and I haven't personally partaken in it in a very long time, but something else I found very valuable is group work, actually. And I haven't facilitated a group as a practitioner in a while, but I do have a fantasy of getting back into it in the next year.
It's tough logistically and just trying to find times that everybody can show up, even if it's a Zoom call, and that obviously brings up limitations too. But yeah, group work is incredibly powerful. I have participated in and facilitated groups for men, specifically only men, and then also for men and women within the same group. And the growth that can come from that is it's not just encouraging; it's also kind of humbling because it probably happened to you too as a therapist. You don't have to say a whole lot; they get a whole lot of the growth just from interacting with each other. And I'm kind of just sitting there watching it like, wait a minute, this is supposed to be about my healing powers. It's like, wait,
Yeah.
oh, wait, it's about y'all, not about me. Huh? How'd that work?
Yeah. Exactly, exactly. You said when we were off camera that you had some questions for me. Did you want to get to any of those today?
I definitely do. How did you even
Mm.
get into therapy in the first place? Was it a lifelong thing? Did somebody influence you as well? What was the journey like?
Yeah. You know, I for it actually wasn't the grad school I ended up going to, but one of the ones I applied to, they asked this question, what are your personal motivations for
Mm.
wanting to become a psychologist? It was a clinical psych program. And then they say, this question is asking for a degree of self disclosure. You may not talk about your desire to help others or impact society in a positive way. And so I remember sitting there and I remember thinking so hard. I was like, okay, so they want me to be personal, but I can't be inappropriate. And, because I think, and this is stuff I've openly shared about. I mean, you could think, losing one's dad and like all the therapy in my adolescent years obviously affected my identity development.
Hmm.
And you can think about, like maybe being gay, like there's kind of, maybe there's something there. Maybe it's just like my hardwired personality, right? Like I'm very analytical and very open-minded, not very judgmental, very warm in my
Hmm.
temperament. And so just from a personality fit, it makes sense. But what I
Hmm.
wrote the essay about, and I do think it's a decent answer, is I actually talk about being a big brother because my little brother was born when I was 6 years old. I remember his birth. And I remember seeing this like little baby in the hospital. I remember getting to hold him for the first time. And I remember just being like, just like so enthralled that, that I could help take care of this little life. And so, what we know about developmental psych, 6 years old, that's kind of an interesting time, to be told that you're big and to start being like rewarded for, because I remember I could, I just got so much, I don't know if self-worth is exactly quite the right word, but I got so much positive reinforcement, because I was so good with him. And again, maybe, some of it was, genetic or kind of like hardwired, or like maybe we believe in fate. I don't know, but I do have distinct memories of, being so good with this baby and told you're a good big brother and I'm six, like I
Yeah.
wasn't big at
Right.
all. You know what I mean? Like I
Right.
was literally 6 years old. And so that's how I think of my origin story. I didn't, I didn't see it coming, but my mom does say that when, and it may have even been before my brother was born or around the same time, she tells this story about how her and my dad were fighting. Not, in a totally like normative, healthy way. They were having an adult conversation, but but I'm a sensitive child, and I guess I got like I don't think I have any here, but I got some like sticky pads, and I guess I like was like I don't know what I was observing, but I was like tallying them. I was like observing their behavior. And then I went and like gave them the sticky notes after. And so when I told
Wow.
my mom what I wanted to go to grad school for, she was just like, I saw this coming from like a mile away. She was like, I just knew it would take you time to get there. And so, yeah, for, anyone who has skepticism of some of that, developmental literature about how much is formulated by age 5, my story
Yeah.
makes you think,
Yeah. Oh my goodness. That's incredible. Yeah, to think
Yeah.
that you were handing out basically assessments to your parents and
I know, totally.
yeah, if you weren't wired to be a therapist, then nobody was.
Pretty much, right? And so yeah. But then, the more kind of updated version of the story is, I actually was mentored right out of school. She wasn't practicing anymore, but she was trained as a clinical psychologist. She worked in the tech entrepreneurship space. I would actually love to have Katie on the podcast one day, but she. I don't know if when you were that age, someone kind of mentored you, but you basically just do everything they say because
Yep,
you're
exactly.
fresh out of school. And I went to a liberal arts school, so I had zero technical skills, like zero know-how. I really believe in liberal arts for everyone. It's not for everyone. For anyone listening, I don't hate on that model of pedagogy or however you say that word, but I worshipped the ground Katie walked on and basically did everything she said. And that's how, watching how skillful she was with people in the business world, I thought to myself, I want to develop some of those skills. I see how powerful that is. But then when I was in school, COVID hit. And
Mm.
the social media stuff and like all the that stuff I do now is new and definitely not just clinical, but I really like the clinical work, and I think I'll always have a small private practice at the very least.
Yeah. That leads me to my
So
next question. What is your
yeah.
favorite type of issue to work with or type of personality to work with?
It's a good question. I really love working with, it's funny. I remember in grad school, we read this paper and it was basically saying that your clinical interest areas will be directly informed by your practicum and supervisory experience. And I remember thinking, I was like, I'm an independent thinking graduate student, and I will, go and, study this or this. But one of my, they weren't my direct supervisor, but someone that was at the practice who like gave me book recommendations and different things for the different cases I had, is an expert in what they termed the adult children of dysfunctional family systems. So what this basically meant to this practitioner was, you're not a child anymore. You're not still living at home. Maybe you're in contact with your family, maybe you're not. But whatever it was growing up, I mean, maybe it was outright, neglect and abuse. Maybe a parent or a sibling had a personality disorder or an eating disorder. The whole family system kind of, situated themselves around. And now that's affecting the way you do intimacy, the way you do relationships, the way you show up in work. And that's probably my favorite person to work with, because it's so much more difficult and complex than mitigating symptoms, or just teaching skills. Not that I don't like working with kind of the standard depression and anxiety and different things, but it almost feels to me more like there's a re-engineering of how you relate to people, about how you relate to yourself, about how you do intimacy. And there isn't, like I said earlier, it's a craft. There is, there's lots of good workbooks out there and for this population, but it's a lot of what we know about that treatment is really derived from the psychoanalytical literature, which is very hard to study in an evidence-based way. And so that's my personal favorite, because there's often not a diagnosis, not a label that I could, put on the problem. And so and I think that's why I like it, because it's very much every person is their own unique puzzle in a certain sense, right? But that's the population I really like. And that's something I advertise on my practice. And that's often who reaches out to me.
Yeah. I love what you just said at the end there about the lack of a label. So for me, and this was even before becoming a therapist, I just never resonated with the idea of slapping a diagnosis on something and calling it a label, and then because it feels like an identity, first of all, like like I am depressed or I am anxious. So that just, even if you're not a therapist, if you that closely identify yourself with something like that, I feel like you drive it even deeper and make it part of your DNA structure almost. But then also, so many of these actions that we take on the outside that we want to change, they're actually motivated by trying to fill healthy needs. We're just going about filling those healthy needs in an unhealthy way. So yeah, I'm all with you on like, let's not just quickly label or diagnose something as a negative, because the intention is a positive, trying to get those needs met.
Yeah. Well, listen, diagnostic language, identity development, that's a whole nother podcast episode that I would love to do with you, because it's something, I talk about in my content a lot, I think about a lot, and it's just kind of the age we're living in. And so we'll have to have you back. I really, really enjoyed talking with you. As we wrap up, are there any words of wisdom, advice, or anything you want to leave the listeners with?
I try to tell my clients this every day. Think of 2 things you like about yourself and 2 things you're grateful for. And I'm not really good at the first 2, especially because I'm so good at figuring out what's wrong with me, what needs to improve. And so I could quickly come up with a list of more than 2 on that end of it. And when I ask clients to do this at the end of sessions, it takes them a while to think of 2 things they like about themselves. So I would encourage people to give that 10, 20 seconds and see what they think, and then what they're grateful for, because just those 2 things can start to shift under the surface and then create some positive domino effects for other decisions and other moods throughout their day.
Yeah, it's true. And we're all guilty of that. I'm reminded of an episode I had with my friend. He's a really successful business guy, Jimmy. And he said that, one of the things he's learned like in his therapy, he's like, I'm focused on the 5% that's going wrong with my business. Even when 95% of it he's crushing it. And in some ways that's his responsibility as a CEO, but becoming aware of that pattern has been really, really helpful for him because it's kind of crept in. It sounded like, to other ways. And I know I certainly do that too. It's so easy for me to focus on, the one session that wasn't a 10 out of 10 that week, or the one piece of content that didn't get a lot of views or whatever, even though everything else is going so well. So I think that's a great reminder. As we wrap up, how can people find you? How can they keep up with you? How can they reach out to you?
Sure. Yeah. Ruggedcounseling.com is my website. That's probably the easiest or quickest way to go about it. On social media, it's also at Rugged Counseling, or just search in Trey Tucker. So yeah, I'd love to help you out in different ways. I have a few appointments available on there. I do some speaking and consulting as well. So yeah, it'd be fun to interact.
All right. Thank you so much, Trey. We will definitely have you back. And for those of you who are still listening, if you've been enjoying Therapy versus the World, remember, you can listen to this show early and ad-free only on Luminary.